How did Vikings manage waste on longships without getting sick? When we imagine Vikings, we usually picture fierce warriors, dragon-headed ships, crashing waves, and burning villages. We think about axes, shields, and epic sea battles. But almost no one stops to ask a very simple, very human question. What happened when a Viking had to go to the bathroom? It sounds funny at first, maybe even trivial. But if you think about it seriously, it's actually one of the most important survival questions of the Viking Age. Because a Viking longship wasn't a cruise ship. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't spacious. It wasn't clean by modern standards. And it certainly didn't have plumbing. Yet these men spent weeks, sometimes months, at sea. They crossed the freezing North Atlantic. They sailed from Scandinavia to England, Ireland, France, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. They survived brutal storms, cold temperatures, and cramped conditions. So how did they deal with waste? Human waste, food scraps, vomit, blood, and everything else, without spreading disease and killing themselves? The answer is a fascinating combination of practicality, environmental knowledge, ship design, and surprisingly advanced hygiene habits. First, let's understand the environment they were living in. A Viking longship, like the famous ships found at the Oseberg ship burial site or the Gokstad ship, was long and narrow. Some were over 20 meters in length, but only a few meters wide. They had open decks, no cabins, no enclosed bathrooms, just rows of benches where warriors sat and rowed. Everything happened in the open air. That detail alone is extremely important. Unlike later medieval ships that had enclosed lower decks, which became breeding grounds for disease, Viking longships were exposed to constant wind and sea spray. The North Atlantic air is cold, salty, and constantly moving. That natural airflow dramatically reduced the buildup of harmful bacteria. In many ways, the ocean itself acted as their sanitation system. Now let's address the most obvious issue: defecation. There were no toilets, no chamber pots built into the deck, no special waste compartments. Instead, Vikings used the simplest and most effective solution available to them: the sea. When nature called, a sailor would go to the side of the ship and relieve himself directly into the water. Sometimes he would squat on a small plank or hold onto the side railing. On calmer waters, this was relatively easy. During rough seas, it required balance and courage. It may sound primitive, but it was actually highly effective. The ocean is vast beyond comprehension. The waste would instantly disperse into billions of gallons of moving salt water. Salt water inhibits many bacteria. Constant currents carry waste away from the ship almost immediately. Unlike rivers or stagnant water, the open sea does not allow waste to accumulate in one place. In other words, they weren't living in their own filth. Contrast this with later European cities, where human waste was dumped into streets, rivers, and cesspits. In some medieval towns, people literally lived above layers of rotting sewage. That environment created cholera outbreaks, dysentery, and plague. The Vikings at sea avoided that problem simply because they were surrounded by a natural waste disposal system that never stopped moving. But what about urine? Again, the sea. Urination overboard was quick and simple. It required no special setup. And because urine is mostly sterile when it leaves a healthy body, it posed minimal risk when immediately diluted in seawater. However, waste management on a Viking ship wasn't only about bodily functions. Food waste was another major issue. Vikings carried dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, barley, oats, butter, and sometimes fermented dairy products. These foods were chosen specifically because they lasted long periods without refrigeration. But even preserved food produces scraps, bones, fish heads, spoiled portions. So what happened to those? They were thrown overboard as well. Again, the ocean solved the problem. Fish, seabirds, and marine scavengers would quickly consume organic waste. Nothing rotted on deck for long. Rotting organic material is dangerous not just because it smells, but because it attracts flies and rodents. Flies carry bacteria. Rodents carry disease. But here's the critical difference. Viking longships were not floating wooden houses packed with cargo below deck. They were lean, efficient warships and transport vessels. There was very little enclosed space for rats to hide. Also because they frequently landed on shores rather than staying anchored in ports for months. Infestations were less likely to become permanent. Another overlooked factor is Viking bathing culture. Contrary to popular myths, Vikings were not filthy barbarians. In fact, many historical sources describe them as surprisingly clean. The Anglo-Saxon chronicler John of Wallingford complained that Vikings in England were too clean. He claimed they bathed weekly, combed their hair daily, and changed clothes regularly, which made them more attractive to local women. Bathing once a week may not sound impressive today, but in medieval Europe it was exceptional. Many Christian clerics of the time associated excessive bathing with vanity or sin. Public bathing culture had declined after the fall of Roman Empire. Cleanliness standards in some regions dropped dramatically. Vikings, on the other hand, maintained grooming tools as part of their personal kits. Archaeologists have found combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, and even nail cleaning tools in Viking graves. So even at sea, basic hygiene mattered. When ships stopped at rivers or coastal settlements, crews likely washed themselves whenever possible. Freshwater rinsing removes salt, buildup, sweat, and bacteria. Even a quick splash reduces skin infections. Now think about ventilation again. Because Viking ships were open-decked, sunlight constantly hit the wood. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun naturally kills many pathogens. The decks dried quickly after waves washed over them. Dry wood is far less hospitable to bacteria than damp, enclosed spaces. Compare that to later sailing ships during the Age of Exploration, where sailors slept in dark, moist lower decks for months. Those ships became floating disease factories. The Viking design unintentionally created a healthier micro-environment. But there is another dimension we need to explore: winter voyages and cold climates. Cold temperatures are powerful disease suppressors. Many bacteria and parasites struggle to thrive in near-freezing air. Viking expeditions often sailed in northern waters where temperatures remain low for much of the year. In cold air, decay slows dramatically. So between salt water, wind, sunlight, and cold, Viking ships were surprisingly hostile to the spread of many pathogens. Of course, this does not mean Vikings never got sick. They absolutely did. They suffered infections from wounds. They dealt with parasites. They experienced food poisoning and dysentery occasionally. But the specific threat of waste-borne epidemic outbreaks at sea was likely lower than in crowded medieval towns. There's also something important about crew size. A typical longship might carry 30 to 60 men. That's a small, tightly bonded group, not hundreds of strangers packed together. Smaller groups mean fewer disease vectors. If someone became ill, exposure was limited compared to urban populations. And Viking crews were not random collections of people. They were often relatives, neighbors, or members of the same community. That familiarity may have influenced behavioral discipline and hygiene standards. Now consider one more overlooked factor: voyage length. Viking raids were often fast. They didn't spend months drifting aimlessly. They would sail to a target, raid quickly, and return home. Or they would travel coastal routes, stopping frequently. Frequent landings allowed waste reset. On land, they could dig latrine pits away from camp. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows designated waste areas. They understood basic sanitation separation, keeping living areas away from waste zones. This separation principle is one of the oldest public health concepts in human history. Keep food and water away from feces. Vikings followed it naturally. Even in larger Viking towns like Hedeby and Birka, excavations reveal structured layouts, drainage, and waste deposits placed strategically away from central activity areas. They were not ignorant of sanitation. They were practical, very practical. And practicality is the true secret behind how they managed waste without getting sick. They used the ocean for disposal, wind for ventilation, salt water for dilution, cold for preservation control, sunlight for sterilization, small crews for containment, frequent landings for sanitation resets. It wasn't sophisticated plumbing. It was environmental intelligence. When you live in one of the harshest climates on Earth, you learn quickly what works and what kills you. The Vikings were brutal warriors, yes, but they were also experienced sailors, traders, farmers, and survivors. They understood their environment deeply, and that understanding kept them alive, even in situations that would seem unbearably unsanitary to us today. But we've only scratched the surface, because managing human waste was just one part of the hygiene puzzle. What about menstrual hygiene? What about sickness outbreaks? What about dead bodies at sea? What about blood from battle? What about lice and parasites? And what about the long voyages to places like Greenland and Vinland? Those journeys changed everything. We'll dive deeper into the darker, more uncomfortable realities of life aboard a Viking longship, and discover whether their sanitation methods were truly enough, or if survival sometimes came down to luck. If we're going to truly understand how Vikings avoided serious illness at sea, we have to talk about something even less glamorous than toilets. Parasites. Because waste isn't the only health threat on a ship. In fact, parasites were often a much bigger problem than bacteria. Archaeologists studying Viking settlements like York, which was known as Jorvik during Norse control, have found fossilized parasite eggs in preserved latrine soil. These include roundworms and whipworms, common intestinal parasites in medieval Europe. That tells us something important. Vikings absolutely dealt with parasites on land, but ships were a different environment. Intestinal parasites typically spread through contaminated food or water. If human waste gets into drinking supplies, parasite eggs travel into the body. In dense urban environments with poor sewage separation, this becomes a cycle. But on a Viking longship, drinking water was stored in barrels. Barrels were sealed. Water wasn't drawn from stagnant pools on deck. It wasn't sitting near waste pits. It was contained. And because voyages were often relatively short between landings, water was replenished frequently. Also, Vikings commonly drank more than just water. They drank ale. Low-alcohol beverages were safer than untreated freshwater in many medieval societies because the brewing process killed many pathogens. Even weak ale reduced the risk of waterborne disease. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about survival. Now imagine a 30-man crew on open water. If someone became seriously ill with diarrhea, for example, the solution was immediate disposal overboard. There was no accumulation. No chamber pots sitting inside enclosed rooms. No underground bilge filled with waste. The ocean carried everything away. This constant removal cycle prevented the kind of concentrated contamination that destroyed later naval expeditions. For example, Centuries later, during the voyages of Christopher Columbus, ships had enclosed lower decks where waste and moisture accumulated. Combined with the poor ventilation, that created disease-friendly conditions. Viking ships avoided that structural mistake entirely. But what about lice? Lice were universal in medieval Europe. And yes, Vikings had them too. Combs are among the most common Viking artifacts, discovered in graves and settlements. Many are beautifully carved from bone or antler. That tells us grooming wasn't optional. It was cultural. Daily combing helps control lice populations. It doesn't eliminate them entirely, but it reduces infestations significantly. And because Viking crews often shaved parts of their heads or wore tightly bound hair, they reduced parasite hiding spaces. Beards were common, but grooming tools suggest maintenance was regular. There's also something many people overlook: salt. Salt water is uncomfortable for lice and many small parasites. Constant sea spray and exposure to salty wind likely helped limit outbreaks compared to inland settlements. Now let's talk about vomit. Seasickness was very real. Imagine rowing for hours in cold water, stomach empty or filled with salted fish, waves crashing against the hull. People got sick. But again, the open deck design helped. Vomit went overboard. Rain and sea spray washed decks frequently. The ship was self-cleaning in a way. The ocean is messy, but it's also constantly cleansing. However, there's one topic we can't avoid. What happened when someone died at sea? Death was not uncommon in the Viking Age. In battle, from infection, from exposure, from accidents. If a crew member died during a voyage, keeping a corpse on a small ship would have been dangerous. Decomposition produces bacteria and attracts pests. So what did they do? The most practical answer is also the most likely: sea burial. While dramatic ship burnings are popular in movies, those were rare ceremonial events on land. At sea, practicality ruled. A body would likely be wrapped, weighted, and committed to the ocean. Quick removal prevented contamination. And culturally, this wasn't seen as dishonorable. The sea was central to Viking identity. Dying on a voyage could even be considered fitting. Speaking of cultural beliefs, we should address something else important. Hygiene in Viking society wasn't just practical. It was tied to honor. Cleanliness signaled discipline. A warrior who couldn't maintain his gear, his hair, and his health was seen as careless. And carelessness in a warrior culture could mean death. That social pressure likely reinforced habits that indirectly reduced disease. Now let's shift focus slightly. Long-distance voyages to places like Iceland and later Greenland required weeks at sea. These weren't quick raids. These were migration journeys. So how did sanitation hold up over longer periods? First, Viking ships weren't continuously packed for months without stopping. Even long Atlantic crossings included coastal navigation and opportunities to land. Second, climate again played a massive role. Cold northern voyages meant slower bacterial growth. Third, diet mattered. High-protein, low-sugar diets reduced some digestive disorders. Vikings ate preserved fish, meat, grains, not refined sugars. That doesn't make them immune to illness, but it does change gut microbiology compared to later European populations consuming more processed foods. There's also evidence from excavations in Bergen that Viking-era settlements had structured waste areas and drainage systems. This suggests that even on land, they understood separation between living space and refuse. That knowledge would naturally transfer to shipboard behavior. Another often ignored factor is psychological resilience. Stress weakens the immune system. But Viking crews were not tourists terrified of storms. They were trained from youth to row, sail, and endure hardship. The mental conditioning may have reduced stress-related illness. We shouldn't romanticize it. Life was brutal. But these were adapted populations. And adaptation is everything. Now let's address blood. Vikings were warriors. Raids meant combat. Combat meant blood. On a ship returning from battle, there could be wounded men bleeding onto wooden planks. Blood is a biological hazard. But again, open decks and seawater made a difference. Seawater was often used to rinse wounds and clean surfaces. Salt water has mild antiseptic properties. Not perfect, but better than stagnant fresh water contaminated with waste. Decks could be washed down simply by throwing buckets of seawater across them. No lower enclosed decks meant no dark, moist chambers for bacteria to multiply unnoticed. The design of the ship itself prevented stagnation. And that word, stagnation, is the key to understanding everything. Disease thrives in stagnant conditions. Stagnant water, stagnant air, stagnant waste. Viking longships were the opposite of stagnant. They were constantly moving, constantly exposed, constantly ventilated. In many ways, their primitive design was biologically advantageous. Ironically, as ship technology advanced in later centuries, adding multiple decks and enclosed spaces, sanitation problems actually worsened. Progress created new risks. Viking simplicity protected them. But we still haven't addressed one final uncomfortable topic: menstrual hygiene. While long-distance war raids were primarily male-dominated, migration voyages included women. Archaeological evidence from settlements in Iceland and Greenland shows family groups traveled. Managing menstruation in a maritime environment required cloth absorbents, likely linen or wool, which could be rinsed in seawater and later washed properly when fresh water was available on land. Again, separation and disposal were key. Cloth was reusable. Waste went overboard. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't luxurious. But it was functional. And functionality is what kept Viking voyages from turning into floating disease outbreaks. Still, none of this means they were immune to sickness. They suffered. They endured infections. They died from wounds more often than from sanitation failure. Which tells us something important. Waste management wasn't perfect. But it was good enough. And in the Viking world, good enough meant survival. We'll explore something even more fascinating. How Viking shipbuilding techniques unintentionally created one of the healthiest naval environments of the medieval world. And why later empires actually did worse. If we really want to understand why Viking ships didn't turn into floating disease factories, we have to examine something that rarely gets credit: the engineering. Because sanitation is not just about habits. It's about structure. And Viking shipbuilding was far more advanced than most people realize. The longships were built using what's known as clinker construction, overlapping planks riveted together. This design made the ships flexible, lightweight, and incredibly seaworthy. One of the best surviving examples, discovered near the Oseberg ship, shows just how carefully these vessels were constructed. The overlapping planks weren't sealed airtight. Tiny gaps allowed slight airflow. Combined with an open deck, this meant moisture rarely stayed trapped for long. That detail matters more than you might think. Moisture is one of the biggest drivers of bacterial growth. When wood stays damp in enclosed darkness, microbes thrive. But when wood is exposed to wind and sun, it dries quickly. Dry wood dramatically slows microbial survival. Viking ships dried constantly. They were designed to be hauled ashore regularly. Unlike later medieval ships that stayed anchored offshore, longships were shallow drafted. Crews could row them straight onto beaches. This meant ships were often tilted, emptied, inspected, repaired, and aired out. Imagine the difference between a boat that never leaves water and one that gets pulled onto land frequently. Drying resets the microbial clock. Now let's compare this to later naval disasters. During the 15th and 16th centuries, ships sailing under powers like Spain and Portugal carried massive crews on multi-decked vessels. Waste accumulated in bilges, the lowest part of the ship, where water mixed with rot, urine, food scraps, and sometimes dead rats. The air below deck became toxic. Sailors slept in that environment for months. Viking ships had no such lower deck compartments. Everyone lived in the same open-air space. That might sound uncomfortable, but biologically, it was safer. Ventilation is one of the most powerful disease prevention tools in human history, and Vikings had it built into their design centuries before germ theory existed. Now let's talk about bilge water. All ships take on some water. Viking ships were no exception. But because longships were smaller and frequently landed, bilge water didn't sit for months. It was bailed out regularly. Crews physically removed accumulated water using buckets. Physical labor was constant. And constant maintenance is itself a sanitation strategy. Neglected environments rot. Maintained environments survive. Another overlooked element is material choice. Viking ships were primarily made from oak. Oak contains tannins, natural compounds with antimicrobial properties. While not strong enough to sterilize surfaces, tannins can slow microbial growth compared to softer woods. This may have offered slight biological advantages over other materials. Now consider clothing. Vikings wore wool and linen. Wool has natural antibacterial properties due to lanolin. It resists odor and bacterial buildup better than many plant fibers. In a maritime setting, this is useful. Clothing absorbs sweat. Sweat feeds bacteria. But wool's structure helps limit odor-causing microbes. Again, this isn't modern hygiene, but it's subtle environmental advantage. We also have archaeological insights from sites like Hedeby, where preserved wooden structures and waste layers show organized disposal areas. Waste wasn't randomly scattered. There were zones. That zoning mindset likely existed on ships too, even informally. For example, certain sides of the ship may have been used more frequently for waste disposal depending on wind direction. Experienced sailors would know instinctively not to relieve themselves on the windward side where spray could return. Seafaring culture creates practical rules very quickly. Let's also consider food storage again. Barrels were crucial. Sealed containers prevent contamination. Viking cooperage. The craft of barrel making was highly skilled. Tight-fitting staves and iron hoops created durable containers for water, ale, and food. If waste never touches your stored water or preserved meat, you break the disease cycle. It sounds obvious, but many later historical disasters occurred because water and waste systems were poorly separated. The Vikings' smaller scale helped them maintain control. There's also evidence that Vikings used wooden bowls and personal utensils, rather than communal troughs in some contexts. Individual utensils reduce cross-contamination. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. Now let's talk about one more critical survival factor: mobility. A Viking longship was rarely stationary for long in open water unless conditions demanded it. Constant movement means constant airflow. Even slight forward motion creates wind across the deck. Airflow dries surfaces. Airflow disperses odor. Airflow reduces airborne pathogen. Compare that to enclosed medieval castles, monasteries, or urban homes where smoke, dampness, and human waste lingered in enclosed courtyards. Ironically, life at sea may have been cleaner than life in certain European towns. For example, in parts of medieval London, waste disposal into streets and the River Thames created serious sanitation issues. Meanwhile, a Viking ship in the North Sea had an effectively infinite waste removal system beneath it. Scale matters. Environment matters. Design matters. But we still need to confront something deeper. Why didn't disease wipe out Viking expeditions during long Atlantic crossings? Because crossing to places like Greenland and later to Vinland was not a short coastal raid. It required resilience over distance. Part of the answer lies in population immunity. Scandinavian populations had long been exposed to harsh climates and certain endemic diseases. Over generations, communities developed resistance to local pathogens. While this doesn't make them invincible, it stabilizes survival rates within small groups. Another part of the answer is selective survival. Viking expeditions were not random draws of the weakest members of society. They were physically capable individuals. Warriors, sailors, farmers accustomed to manual labor and cold exposure. Stronger immune systems statistically fare better in harsh environments. That doesn't mean no one got sick. It means the sick were less likely to survive long enough to become chronic carriers within a ship's confined population. Harsh, yes, but evolutionarily consistent. Now consider one final element of ship life: sleeping arrangements. Crew members slept under simple woolen cloaks or tents stretched across part of the deck. At night, when the ship was anchored or beached, shields might be used to create wind barriers. Even then, airflow remained constant. No sealed cabins. No mold-friendly bunk rooms. Open-air sleeping reduces transmission of respiratory diseases compared to enclosed, shared air environments. Again, Viking design accidentally aligned with modern public health principles, centuries before anyone understood microbes. Fresh air, sunlight, ventilation, separation of waste, frequent drying. All accidental advantages. And here's the irony. As European shipbuilding evolved into larger, more advanced vessels during the age of exploration, sanitation often worsened dramatically. Enclosed gun decks, cargo holds, and lower sleeping quarters created stagnant air pockets. Technology improved navigation, but biology was ignored. The Vikings, in contrast, never sacrificed airflow for comfort. Their ships were uncomfortable, cold, wet, exposed, but biologically safer in some respects. Now we're ready to move into an even deeper question. If their sanitation systems were so practical, why do we still imagine Vikings as filthy barbarians? Where did that stereotype come from? And how much of it is myth created by their enemies? We'll examine the clash between Viking hygiene culture and medieval Christian Europe, and uncover why historical propaganda shaped how we view them today. The image most people have of Vikings didn't come from archaeology. It came from their enemies. Medieval Christian chroniclers in places like Canterbury and Paris wrote about Viking raids with horror. Monasteries were attacked, treasures were stolen, religious sites were burned. To the monks recording these events, Vikings weren't just raiders. They were pagan invaders. And when your monastery has just been looted, you're not going to write a balanced cultural review. You're going to describe the attackers as savage, godless, filthy barbarians. That narrative stuck for centuries. But archaeology tells a more complicated story. Excavations at former Viking settlements, such as Jorvik, reveal combs, grooming tools, ear scoops, tweezers, and even evidence of regular bathing practices. Grooming kits were common personal possessions. Clean hair, trim beards, maintained nails. These were not random discoveries. They appear again and again across Scandinavia and Viking-controlled territories. In fact, one English chronicler, John of Wallingford, complained that Vikings bathed too often. He wrote that they combed their hair daily and changed clothes regularly, making them attractive to English women. That detail matters. You don't get accused of being too clean if you're living in constant filth. So why does the dirty Viking stereotype persist? Because hygiene in the Viking Age looked different from modern hygiene, but that doesn't mean it was absent. Let's go back to the ships. When people imagine medieval ships, they often picture dark wooden hulls soaked in grime. But a Viking longship was constantly exposed to rain, waves, wind, and sunlight. Imagine living outdoors for weeks. It's harsh, it's uncomfortable, but it's not enclosed filth. Now compare that to urban medieval life in parts of London or Rouen during the same era. Waste was frequently dumped into streets. Chamber pots were emptied from windows, animals roamed freely. Urban density created contamination loops. Viking ships didn't have density. They had exposure. Exposure can be deadly in storms, but it's surprisingly effective against microbial buildup. Let's think about smell. A tightly enclosed medieval house filled with smoke from indoor fires, unwashed bodies, animal skins, and stored waste would trap odor. A Viking ship, however, was ventilated 24 hours a day. Odor disperses quickly in open air. That doesn't mean it smelled pleasant. Salted fish and wet wool aren't perfume, but it wasn't trap decay. There's also an environmental factor most people overlook. Cold climates reduce insect populations. Flies thrive in warm, stagnant conditions. They breed in waste. They spread disease. Northern seas don't offer ideal breeding environments for flies. Fewer flies means fewer disease vectors. Now let's talk about discipline. A Viking ship functioned like a team organism. Each crew member had responsibility, rowing in rhythm, maintaining equipment, following commands. Waste mismanagement wouldn't just be unpleasant. It would interfere with survival. On a small vessel, you can't ignore a problem. There's nowhere to hide it. That social pressure enforces practical sanitation. If someone behaved carelessly, the group would correct them quickly. Survival depended on cooperation. And that cooperation extended to hygiene habits. There's another fascinating layer to the story. In Norse culture, concepts of order versus chaos were deeply embedded in worldview. The cosmos itself was structured. From Odin ruling in Asgard to the great world tree Yggdrasil connecting realms. Chaos was dangerous. Disorder invited destruction. While we shouldn't exaggerate religious influence on daily sanitation, cultural respect for order likely reinforced disciplined ship life. Now let's address something practical again. How often did they actually clean the ship? Quite often. Saltwater rinsing wasn't optional. Waves constantly washed over the deck. During storms, the entire ship would be soaked. After landing, crews would tip the vessel slightly, inspect planks, repair damage, and likely scrape off buildup. Marine life attaches quickly to hulls. Removing it improves speed. So scraping and maintenance were routine. Maintenance equals sanitation. And here's something fascinating. Because Viking ships were light and flexible, they required constant care. That necessity prevented neglect. Neglect breeds disease. Attention prevents it. Now let's confront reality honestly. Did Vikings suffer illness from poor sanitation sometimes? Yes. Archaeological studies show evidence of intestinal parasites in some populations. Life expectancy was lower than today. Infections could be deadly. But here's the key difference. Large-scale shipboard epidemics, the kind that devastated later naval fleets. are not strongly associated with Viking longship voyages. And that's remarkable, especially considering they sailed centuries before germ theory. The explanation isn't advanced medicine. It's environmental alignment. Their ship design, climate, crew size, and mobility unintentionally created a relatively low-risk sanitation environment. Now think about one final psychological element. Modern people are extremely sensitive to discomfort. We live in climate-controlled buildings with running water and disinfectants. Vikings lived in a world where exposure was constant. Their immune systems were trained in harsher environments from childhood: cold exposure, outdoor labor, animal contact. That doesn't make them superhuman, but it does mean their bodies were adapted to a different microbial world. And adaptation is everything. By now, we've explored waste disposal, parasites, ship design, cultural hygiene, propaganda myths, and environmental advantages. But there's one more dimension we haven't fully examined. What happened when Vikings transitioned from sea to settlement? Did their sanitation habits change when they built towns in places like Dublin and York? And did urban living introduce new health risks they hadn't faced at sea? Because life on land is very different from life on open water. We'll explore how Viking sanitation evolved in growing settlements, and whether their practical sea habits survived once they stopped moving. Life at sea was mobile. Life on land was not. And that single difference changes everything. When Vikings began establishing permanent settlements in places like Dublin, York, their Jorvik, and trading hubs like Hedeby, they entered a completely different sanitation environment. At sea, waste vanished into infinity. On land, waste accumulates. And accumulation is where disease begins. Archaeological excavations in Viking towns reveal something fascinating. They created designated waste layers. In sites like Bergen and Hedeby, researchers have uncovered thick deposits of organic material: food scraps, animal bones, broken tools, even human waste, concentrated in specific areas rather than randomly scattered. That tells us something important. They organized refuse. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't sterile. But it wasn't chaotic either. Many Viking settlements used what archaeologists call backyard middens. A midden is essentially a waste heap, but it's positioned deliberately behind living quarters. Separation. That same principle they practice at sea. Keep waste away from living space. Continued on land. In some towns, wooden plank walkways were built above muddy streets. That suggests awareness of wet, contaminated ground conditions. If you elevate foot traffic, you reduce contact with waste-saturated soil. Now let's be honest. These towns were not modern cities. They smelled, they had parasites, they dealt with illness. Excavations in York have revealed preserved fecal matter containing parasite eggs. That tells us intestinal worms were present. But here's the critical difference again. Density. Even in larger Viking towns, population density was lower than later medieval cities. Houses were spaced more generously. Many settlements were semi-rural trade hubs rather than overcrowded stone cities. Lower density reduces outbreak speed. There's another overlooked element: climate again. Northern Europe's cooler temperatures slow bacterial growth compared to warmer Mediterranean regions. Cold winters act like natural reset buttons. Freezing temperatures kill many pathogens and parasite eggs in exposed environments. So every year, winter partially sterilized the landscape. And now let's connect this back to ships. Viking sailors didn't suddenly become careless when they stepped on land. Their maritime habits shaped their thinking. If you spend your life on a vessel where discipline and maintenance mean survival, you carry that mentality into settlement life. For example, wooden buildings require constant upkeep in wet climates. Rot spreads quickly if ignored, so maintenance culture was already embedded in society. Maintenance culture and sanitation culture are closely linked. Now let's talk about water sources. Access to clean water is everything. Many Viking settlements were positioned near rivers, streams, or coastal inlets with flowing water. Flowing water is safer than stagnant pools. The same logic that made the ocean a safe waste disposal system applied to rivers, as long as waste was deposited downstream from drinking sources. While we don't have written sanitation manuals from the Viking Age, the physical layout of settlements suggests basic environmental logic was followed. Another important factor is livestock management. Animals create waste. If livestock roam freely through living spaces, contamination increases dramatically. Archaeological evidence suggests animals were often kept in designated enclosures or specific sections of settlements. Again, separation. It's simple. But simple systems work. Now let's address something uncomfortable. Did Vikings suffer outbreaks? Yes. They were not immune to epidemic disease, but large-scale plague pandemics, like the later Black Death, which devastated Europe centuries after the Viking Age, occurred in far more urbanized, trade-connected, densely packed environments. When the Black Death struck Europe, cities like Florence and London experienced catastrophic mortality, partly because of density and rat populations. During the height of the Viking Age, urban density hadn't yet reached those levels in Scandinavia, so scale protected them. Scale is a hidden factor in health. Now let's pivot back to ship life one more time. There's a reason longships didn't carry massive cargo holds filled with grain and livestock for months, like later merchant ships. They were designed for speed and flexibility. Quick raids, quick retreats, coastal travel, frequent landings. Frequent landings allowed waste reset. On shore, they could dig temporary latrine pits far from camp. Archaeological digs at temporary encampments show evidence of fire pits and short-term occupation layers, but not thick, permanent waste buildup. They didn't stay long enough for sanitation crises to develop. Mobility is health. Still, one question remains. What about long-term colonies like those in Greenland? Greenland settlements survived for centuries in harsh climates. They managed livestock, farming, and community life. There, sanitation challenges were real, but freezing temperatures played a massive role in slowing decay. Cold air is a powerful microbial suppressor. In permafrost conditions, organic material can remain preserved for centuries, which is why archaeologists find intact artifacts today. Cold preserved history, and in some ways, it preserved health. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. The reason Vikings didn't get constantly sick from waste on longships wasn't because they had advanced medical knowledge. It wasn't because they were magically immune. It was because their entire lifestyle aligned with environmental realities. Open air, constant movement, low density, frequent drying, separation of waste, cold climate, cultural discipline. None of these alone would guarantee safety. But together, they formed a resilient system. A system built not by theory, but by experience. When you sail rough northern seas for generations, bad habits kill quickly. Only practical systems survive. And Viking society was brutally practical. But we're not done yet. There's one final layer to uncover. If Viking sanitation was relatively effective, why did their Greenland colonies eventually collapse? Was disease part of the story? Was sanitation still enough when climate shifted? We'll explore the environmental limits of Viking resilience and what their eventual struggles reveal about the fragile balance between humans, waste, and survival. By now, we understand something important. Viking sanitation worked because of movement, airflow, separation, and climate. But what happens when one of those elements changes? What happens when mobility decreases and the environment turns against you? To answer that, we need to look at one of the most fascinating Viking experiments in survival. Their colonies in Greenland. Greenland was not a temporary raid location. It was a settlement. Farms were built. Churches were constructed. Livestock were raised. Communities formed. Unlike longships, constantly washed by salt water and wind, Greenland settlements were fixed in place. And that changes sanitation entirely. At sea, waste disappears. On land, especially in a fragile Arctic environment, waste accumulates, slowly but persistently. Greenland's Norse settlers relied on livestock, cattle, sheep, goats. Animal manure builds up quickly. If not managed carefully, it contaminates soil and water sources. Archaeological studies of Norse Greenland farms show that manure was sometimes reused as fertilizer and fuel. That's practical. But it also increases exposure risk. Unlike the open decks of a longship, farm life concentrates organic material. And then something even bigger happened. Climate shifted. During what historians call the medieval warm period, Greenland was marginally more hospitable. Farming was difficult, but possible. Then temperatures began to drop. The onset of what later became known as the Little Ice Age made conditions harsher. Colder winters, shorter growing seasons, more sea ice blocking trade routes. When trade routes weaken, resupply weakens. When resupply weakens, resources tighten. And when resources tighten, sanitation often suffers. If water sources freeze or become limited, cleaning becomes harder. If livestock die in greater numbers during harsh winters, carcass disposal becomes critical. If waste accumulates in enclosed winter housing, disease risk increases. Unlike their ships, Greenland farms could not rely on constant airflow and movement. They relied on storage. Storage is where sanitation becomes complex. Now, it's important not to oversimplify. There is no strong evidence that a sanitation-driven epidemic alone caused Greenland's Norse collapse. But environmental stress amplifies every weakness in a system. On longships, environmental forces helped them. In Greenland, environmental forces eventually worked against them. Mobility shrank, trade declined, isolation increased. And isolation changes disease dynamics. On ships, if someone became seriously ill, the group was small and transient. In a permanent colony cut off from wider networks, illness can linger within a closed population. Yet even here, Vikings demonstrated practical adaptation. They built stone and turf houses designed for insulation. Waste from animals was often kept in separate structures. Winter housing for livestock was typically adjacent, but not identical to human living quarters. Again, separation. Even in extreme conditions, that principle remained. Now let's return briefly to the sea, because the sea was their greatest protection. When Vikings traveled between Iceland, Greenland, and mainland Scandinavia, they reset their sanitation environment. Salt water cleaned hulls, wind-dried surfaces. Movement dispersed waste. Ships were not stagnant environments. And stagnation is the true enemy of health. There's another dimension we haven't explored fully: nutrition. A malnourished population is more vulnerable to disease. At sea, Viking crews consumed high-protein diets. Dried fish, meat, grains. Protein supports immune function. Fat provides energy in cold climates. But in Greenland's later years, evidence suggests dietary shifts occurred. Some studies show increased reliance on marine mammals as farming declined. Dietary stress affects immunity. And immunity affects how well populations handle parasites and infections. So sanitation doesn't exist in isolation. It interacts with climate, with diet, with mobility, with trade, with social structure. The Viking longship represented a near-perfect balance of these elements. Small crew, constant airflow, infinite waste disposal, frequent landings, cold climate suppression of bacteria. It was a floating adaptation machine. But permanent settlement removes several of those advantages. And that's the broader lesson. Sanitation success is context-dependent. The Vikings were not magically cleaner than everyone else. They were environmentally aligned. At sea, alignment favored them. In Greenland's later centuries, alignment weakened. Still, we must avoid exaggeration. There is no clear archaeological evidence that Viking longships were plagued by constant outbreaks of sanitation-related disease. If anything, the design protected them from the worst problems that later afflicted massive naval fleets. Centuries after the Viking Age, ships sailing under empires faced devastating scurvy outbreaks, dysentery, and shipboard infections. Ironically, technological advancement. Enclosed decks, larger crews, longer non-stop voyages, increased vulnerability. The Vikings, with their simpler open-air vessels, avoided many of those risks unintentionally. And that brings us to something fascinating. Modern public health emphasizes ventilation, sunlight, waste separation, clean water, low density. Viking longships had most of these built in by necessity, not by science, by survival. They didn't understand bacteria. They understood consequences. If waste wasn't disposed of properly, it smelled. If the deck stayed wet too long, wood rotted. If someone neglected maintenance, the ship slowed. If water spoiled, people got sick. Observation replaced theory. And over generations, observation becomes tradition. Tradition becomes culture. Culture becomes survival. So when we ask how Vikings managed waste on longships without getting sick, the real answer is this. They didn't defeat disease. They avoided creating the conditions where disease thrives. And sometimes, that's the smartest strategy of all. Up to this point, we've talked about ship design, climate, airflow, waste disposal, discipline, and settlement structure. But now we need to look at something even more fundamental, the human body itself. Because sanitation is only half the equation. The immune system is the other half. Vikings were not modern people placed in primitive conditions. They were products of their environment. From childhood, most Scandinavians lived close to animals, soil, smoke from hearth fires, cold air, and unfiltered water sources. Their immune systems were constantly exposed to microbes. This doesn't make them invincible, but it does mean they were immunologically trained. Modern hygiene has reduced infectious disease dramatically, which is good. But it has also reduced daily microbial exposure. Viking bodies were adapted to a high-exposure world. So when waste appeared on a longship deck briefly before being washed away, it wasn't necessarily introducing a completely foreign microbial threat. Their bodies were already familiar with many local pathogens. Now consider crew composition. Viking longship crews were not random strangers from distant continents. They were typically drawn from the same region, sometimes the same village or extended kin network. Shared environment means shared microbial history. When people from radically different disease environments mix, outbreaks are more severe. History gives us tragic examples of this. When Norse explorers reached North America, in places later associated with Vinland, they encountered indigenous populations who had entirely separate disease histories. While we lack detailed outbreak records from that early contact period, Later European colonization, centuries afterward, showed how devastating cross-population disease exchange could be. But Viking longship crews were mostly culturally and biologically homogeneous. That reduces surprise epidemics. Now let's address something else rarely discussed. Fermentation. Vikings consume fermented foods and drinks regularly, including ale and certain preserved dairy products. Fermented foods contain beneficial bacteria that support gut health. A healthy gut microbiome strengthens immune response. We don't have direct microbiological analysis from Viking intestines, of course, but diet patterns suggest relatively stable gut ecosystems compared to populations relying heavily on contaminated urban water. Again, not perfect health, but resilience. Now imagine a longship during a typical voyage, 30 to 50 men. Open sky above, cold wind moving constantly, salt spray coating surfaces, periodic rainfall rinsing planks. Even if someone fell ill with diarrhea, the waste would be immediately dispersed into open ocean. It wouldn't pool beneath sleeping quarters. On later ships during the Age of Exploration, enclosed lower decks allowed pathogens to circulate repeatedly among sleeping sailors. The Vikings avoided recirculation. That's crucial. Disease spreads when exposure repeats in confined air. Longships minimize repetition. There's another factor most people ignore: time. Viking voyages, even long-distance ones, were rarely non-stop multi-month imprisonments at sea. They hugged coastlines, landed frequently, traded, repaired, gathered fresh water. Frequent stops break transmission chains. When a group lands, spreads out, and resets environment, it disrupts disease continuity. Later transoceanic voyages without landfall created entirely different health pressures. Now let's address psychological stress again, but from a biological angle. Chronic stress suppresses immunity. While Viking life was harsh, it was familiar harshness. Modern humans experience psychological stress in abstract ways. Financial anxiety, digital overload, constant mental pressure. Vikings experienced physical stress: cold, rowing, combat, but within a cultural framework that normalized it. When hardship is expected and socially supported, its immune impact can differ from isolated psychological distress. Group cohesion matters. Longships function like tightly bonded teams. Shared purpose reduces internal tension. Reduced internal tension may help immune function. Again, we're not romanticizing. We're analyzing context. Now let's pivot to something very practical. What about insects on ships? Mosquitoes, flies, fleas. Open ocean reduces mosquito presence dramatically. There's no stagnant fresh water for breeding. Flies struggle in constant wind. Fleas are typically carried by rodents. And here's something important. Viking longships were not designed for long-term rodent habitation. They lacked deep cargo holds filled with grain for months at sea. They were lean vessels. Limited food storage meant fewer rodent opportunities. Rodents thrive where food accumulates, and hiding spaces exist where longships offered little of either. Contrast that with later merchant ships transporting massive grain stores between ports. Ideal environments for rat populations. Rats bring fleas. Fleas spread disease. Longships minimize that chain. Now let's talk about another uncomfortable reality: body odor and skin conditions. Living in wool exposed to salt and sweating during rowing would have created strong smells. But odor is not the same as infection. Saltwater exposure can actually reduce certain skin bacteria. Sunlight helps too, while skin infections certainly occurred, especially from wounds. The open-air environment again reduced sustained bacterial moisture. Moist, enclosed environments create fungal growth. Wind and sun suppress it. Everything keeps returning to the same theme. Movement prevents stagnation. Stagnation breeds disease. And longships were the opposite of stagnant. But we're still missing one final perspective. Why didn't they build on-board latrines? Because they didn't need to. Later ships added enclosed heads, designated toilet areas at the bow. These sometimes became contamination points if poorly cleaned. Vikings relied on direct ocean disposal instead of containment systems that required maintenance. They skipped the middle step entirely. No storage, no accumulation, immediate dispersal. It's simple, and simplicity is often more robust than complexity. Now we're approaching the final layer of this entire question. If Viking longships were so biologically resilient, why do we still instinctively assume they must have been disgusting and disease-ridden? Because we project modern expectations onto ancient environments. We imagine no plumbing equals chaos. But sanitation is not about porcelain toilets. It's about waste flow. And the Vikings had one of the most powerful waste flow systems imaginable. The North Atlantic will bring everything together. Ships, settlements, climate, immune systems, and myth. And answer the ultimate question. Were Viking longships actually healthier environments than many medieval cities? At this point, we've examined nearly every practical dimension of Viking sanitation. Open-air ship design, saltwater disposal, cold climate suppression, small crew sizes, mobility, immune adaptation, settlement structure. But there's one final scientific principle that ties everything together: dilution. Modern environmental science follows a simple truth. The solution to pollution is dilution when it happens in a vast, moving system. And nothing on Earth dilutes waste faster than the open ocean. When a Viking relieved himself over the side of a longship, that waste didn't linger. It entered billions of gallons of constantly moving salt water. Within minutes, it was untraceable. No recirculation, no storage, no accumulation. Compare that to medieval cesspits in cities like London or Paris, where waste could sit underground near water supplies for months. There, contamination loops formed. Waste seeped into wells, wells fed households. Households created more waste. On a longship, the loop was broken instantly. Now let's talk about airflow again. But in modern terms, ventilation is now considered one of the most important factors in preventing airborne disease transmission. Hospitals, schools, and public buildings prioritize air exchange rates. A Viking longship had infinite air exchange. There were no walls trapping breath, no sealed ceilings capturing moisture, no enclosed sleeping chambers. Exhaled air dispersed into the atmosphere immediately. Even during bad weather, temporary coverings were minimal and short-term. The biological effect? Respiratory illness transmission rates would likely have been lower than in enclosed medieval homes or monasteries. And that's ironic, because monasteries, often thought of as centers of order and cleanliness, were sometimes enclosed stone complexes with shared sleeping halls. Viking ships, crude as they appear, had better airflow. Now think about sunlight. Ultraviolet radiation damages bacteria and viruses. Modern sanitation systems use UV light for sterilization. A Viking longship deck received constant UV exposure when weather allowed. Wood warmed and dried into the sun. Wet surfaces became dry surfaces. And dry surfaces are hostile to microbial survival. It's not perfect sterilization, but it's continuous natural suppression. Let's also consider time spent at sea versus time on land. Even long-distance voyages to places like Iceland or Greenland involve frequent coastal navigation and landing opportunities. Crews did not float endlessly in mid-ocean for half a year. Frequent resets interrupt disease cycles. Reset, dry, ventilate, move again. Now compare that to 16th century galleons crossing oceans non-stop for months, with hundreds of men confined below deck. Technology improved range, but confinement increased risk. In many ways, Viking ships were biologically optimized by limitation. Small size meant fewer people, less waste, more airflow, less rodent storage, faster maintenance. Everything scaled down, and scale determines health outcomes. Let's zoom out further. Human history shows a consistent pattern. Small, mobile groups suffer fewer epidemic outbreaks than dense, sedentary populations. Hunter-gatherer societies historically experienced fewer large-scale plagues than urban civilizations. The Vikings, especially at sea, operated closer to a mobile group model than an urban model. That mobility shielded them. But there's one final uncomfortable truth. Life expectancy in the Viking Age was lower than today. Infections from wounds could kill. Child mortality was high. Medical knowledge was limited. So we shouldn't romanticize Viking health as superior in every way. They avoided sanitation disasters at sea, but they still lived in a harsh world. The difference is this. Their waste management system was aligned with their environment. And alignment is survival. Now let's confront the central myth one last time. Were Viking longships disgusting floating disease traps? Or were they surprisingly resilient ecosystems? Archaeology gives us no strong evidence of catastrophic, sanitation-driven collapse aboard Viking ships. We find evidence of parasites in settlements. We find signs of hard living. We find proof of struggle. But we do not find records of longship voyages repeatedly destroyed by onboard waste epidemics. Instead, we find centuries of successful maritime expansion. From Scandinavia to the British Isles, to Normandy, to Iceland, to Greenland, and even to North America. That doesn't happen if your ships are biologically dysfunctional. Sustained expansion requires sustainable living conditions. And Viking longships, crude as they seem, were sustainable. Not because they were clean in a modern sense, but because they were dynamic. Dynamic systems resist decay. Static systems rot. The Viking world, at sea, was always moving. And movement kept them alive. We're now ready for the powerful final conclusion, where we bring together myth, biology, engineering, and survival into one definitive answer. When we first asked the question, how did Vikings manage waste on longships without getting sick? It almost sounded like a joke. But it turns out to be one of the most revealing questions you can ask about the Viking world, because it forces us to look past the axes, the shields, the burning monasteries, and focus on biology. Survival isn't just about winning battles. It's about not dying from your own environment. And that's where the Viking longship becomes something remarkable. Let's strip this down to its core. The Vikings did not have plumbing. They did not understand bacteria. They did not have disinfectant. What they had was alignment. Alignment between ship design, climate, behavior, and environment. Their longships were open to the sky, constantly ventilated, constantly dried by wind and sun. Waste wasn't stored, it wasn't collected. It wasn't allowed to stagnate. It was immediately returned to the largest dilution system on Earth, the ocean. No accumulation, no recirculation, no enclosed contamination chambers. Small crews meant fewer vectors of disease. Frequent landings meant regular environmental resets. Cold northern climates slowed microbial growth. Salt water discouraged many parasites, even their cultural habits. Combing hair, maintaining tools, structured camp layouts, reinforced order, They didn't defeat disease with advanced science. They avoided building the kind of conditions where disease explodes. And that's a powerful difference. Now compare that to dense medieval cities like London or Paris during later centuries, where waste piled up in streets, where wells were contaminated, where rodents flourished in enclosed storage areas. Those environments created feedback loops. Waste contamination, illness more, waste, more contamination. Viking longships broke the loop at the very first step. Waste entered infinity. It's not that their lives were clean in a modern sense. They smelled of sweat and wool. They endured parasites. They suffered infections from wounds. Life expectancy was lower. Medicine was primitive. But sanitation disaster, the kind that wipes out entire crews through internal contamination, doesn't appear to have been a defining feature of Viking maritime life. And that matters. Because sustained expansion across centuries requires functional living systems. The Vikings reached Iceland. They settled Greenland. They reached Vinland centuries before Columbus. You don't accomplish that with ships that are biological death traps. You accomplish it with systems that work. Simple systems. Robust systems. Systems built from experience rather than theory. There's something almost poetic about it. Modern humans associate sophistication with complexity. Plumbing systems, enclosed cabins, advanced hull designs. But sometimes, complexity creates new problems. Later European ships added decks, cargo holds, storage chambers. And with them came stagnant air, rat infestations, and concentrated waste zones. In many cases, progress increased vulnerability. The Viking longship, by contrast, was brutally minimal. Open, exposed, unforgiving, but biologically resilient. It worked because it never allowed stagnation. And stagnation, more than dirt, is the true enemy of health. So when we imagine Vikings as filthy barbarians drifting in their own waste, we're projecting a modern misunderstanding onto a world that functioned by different rules. They were not clean in the way we define clean. They were sustainable. And in the harsh logic of the North Atlantic, sustainability is what keeps you alive. The real lesson here isn't about toilets. It's about design. It's about how human survival depends on understanding the environment. Not dominating it, but aligning with it. The Vikings didn't conquer the sea with sanitation, technology. They let the sea handle the sanitation. And sometimes the simplest solution, when it flows endlessly beneath your hull, is the smartest one of all.